Hey guys, Doug the Motherboard Guy here, coming at you with another video about a motherboard. Today's episode is going to be about a motherboard that's relatively important as far as the history of computers and specifically processors is concerned. So I'll just jump right into it. Today's motherboard is the Asus K8N4-E. And this is a motherboard for the Athlon 64 processor. This motherboard, we'll just jump right into what kind of ports and connections it has, and then we'll talk about why this particular time frame was important. So as far as connections go, what we have here is the two PS2 ports for your keyboard and mouse, and then you have the parallel and serial ports. Then just next to that over here we have the USB 2.0 ports. Then above the first set there we have a FireWire and an Ethernet. And then we have enough ports all the way over here for a 5.1 setup for surround sound. We also, interesting right here next to the serial port, we have an SPDIF connector and an optical audio connector. These are for digital audio. These can basically connect the audio that's built into this motherboard and send it to a receiver, connect it to a high-end stereo system, and you wind up with really good sound quality from that. Moving on to the ports directly on here, we have the let's see, power connectors farther down this time. It is right here. This is for power in. It is 24 pins this time instead of 20. And that is because this motherboard takes more power. It is more modern. So they added 4 more pins to get more power into the motherboard in general. And then on top of that, there is also the 4-pin CPU power connector to get more power straight into the CPU itself. CPU is underneath this large fan here. It is an Athlon 64. And then over here we have the 3 memory slots. This takes DDR memory, and this being a socket 754 takes single channel. So that means that it's not running the sticks together to get a faster performance. However, it does allow you to insert individual sticks at a time. You do not have to install them in pairs, which is kind of nice. Over here we have the floppy connector and the 2 IDE connections for your hard drives and your CD drives, things like that. Farther down here, now this is where this gets interesting. This is new enough to have serial ATA. So these connections here, these black ports, are for serial ATA connections to faster hard drives, faster, more modern CD and DVD drives, things like that. Then we have these red serial ATA ports. They're the same connections, but these are hooked up to the chip that's right next to it right here. These are for the serial ATA RAID connection. RAID basically meaning that you can hook up multiple drives and have them perform some function together. You could have them set up as what's called a striped RAID array, which means that you have multiple drives working together in tandem to make the computer faster. Or you could have it as a mirror setup, so you could have, 2 or 3 or more drives that are all connected, storing the same information, so that if one stops working, you still have the information on another one. That's very interesting to have that directly on a motherboard that is not for a server. This is just for a normal computer. Now the front panel connections here at the bottom corner. We have our front USB headers, so if you had USB ports on the front of your case, you would plug them in down here. And then your expansion slots. So the black one here in the center, that's PCI Express 16. So that's where you would plug in a video card. You have 3 PCI Express by 1 slots, and those are for general cards that are not video cards. So like higher end sound card, wireless networking, so you're going to connect this to your router through Wi-Fi, stuff like that. And then it does have standard PCI slots at the bottom for older cards. Now, to go over why this time frame, this type of motherboard is important. Athlon 64 it has 64 in the name because it's a 64-bit processor. It can handle 64 bits of information at a time. So that was a first for home processors for the Athlon 64 to have that. That came out, this was a whole setup around 2003. Prior to that, your processors for home computers, you had the Pentium 4 and you had the Athlon XP. And they both ran 32-bit software. So Windows XP, for instance, is a 32-bit operating system. The Pentium 4 and the Athlon XP were both very good at running that operating system. But they knew, both Intel and AMD both knew that 32-bit was going to be phased out and they were going to be moving on to 64-bit. Intel's way of doing that was to make a processor that only ran 64-bit software, and that was called the Intel Itanium processor. That came out in 2003. And it didn't run 32-bit software. So if you bought a copy of Windows XP from a store and you bought an Intel Itanium, you couldn't install it. It wouldn't work. There were some very specialized operating systems available that you could install on the Itanium, usually things like Unix, but it did not work with Windows. Microsoft did wind up releasing a version of Windows XP to run on the Itanium, but it didn't actually work with any 32-bit software, so you couldn't go back and install, say, Office 2000, or any, say you had Photoshop from 2001 or 2002. You couldn't install it. It wouldn't work. So AMD knew that this was going to be a problem. They came out with the Athlon 64 processor, which is what's on this motherboard. It works natively with 32-bit software, and it also works by extensions with 64-bit software. So it was designed for that from the ground up. It actually works faster in 64-bit mode to run newer software, so you could put, you know, Windows 7 on this and work great in 64-bit. You can run a 32-bit version of Windows 7 on earlier hardware like the Pentium 4. It's very slow. It doesn't work very well. Now, Intel obviously didn't sell any Itanium processors to home users. It actually only came out for servers and workstations, and it wasn't actually hugely successful. So Intel and AMD, they had this cross-licensing agreement in place at this time, meaning that they could use each other's technologies. So Intel used the 64-bit extensions that were put in the Athlon 64, and they put them in the Pentium 4 that they had at the time. The problem is it wasn't really designed to run those from the ground up like this chip was, so it was slower in 64-bit software considerably. So you could run 64-bit Windows 7, for instance, on a very late model Pentium 4. It'd be very slow. Compared to this, you'd see a very large difference. So 2003, that's when this came out. That was a very big turning point for AMD. They started having the faster processors than Intel at that time. And it turned into a problem for Intel, especially for enthusiasts, you know, people who would build their own computers. 2003, 2004, none of them would really use Intel processors unless they really needed it for something specific. You know, if they were a big fan of Intel and they just wanted to support them. Otherwise, you got an AMD processor at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and show this booting up, posting, going into the BIOS and all that, and then we'll be back. Okay, so here we are. We've got the Asus K8N4-E Deluxe all hooked up with power connections. And we got a keyboard and a monitor hooked up as well. So I'm going to use my super high-tech power on device, and I'm going to short out the connections to the power switch. Very high-tech. And let's see what we get. There we go. Press delete. Got it. Boy, that's not focusing very well. There we go. Okay, so here we are. We've got 2 gigabytes of memory. Sitting here in the BIOS setup. I'm going to move my keyboard over so I can actually reach it. Go over here. I'm sitting at the standard. Let's see what it says for CPU. Okay, so we have an Athlon 64, 3400 plus, 2.4 gigahertz. Now, AMD had been doing this for some time. They had actually been using a naming scheme basically to tell you how fast your processor was in relation to the Intel equivalent. So this processor runs at 2.4 gigahertz, but it's as fast, according to AMD, as a 3.4 gigahertz Pentium 4. And they're not wrong. This processor is about that fast. So their naming convention was pretty spot on with the Athlon 64s, at least in the early time. So not too bad. CPU sitting at 36 degrees. Yeah, we got this big cooler on it with this big fan, so I'm not surprised it's running nicely. So there you have it. It's standard BIOS setup there, and looks to be working well. So thanks for watching the video about the Asus K8N4-E Deluxe motherboard. I'm gonna get some more videos out to you fairly soon. I can tell you that my next video is going to be about the processor and motherboard that was used right before the Athlon 64. This is a processor from the Athlon XP era, although it's not actually an Athlon XP. This is a specialized processor, so something very interesting that they did with the Athlon XP line. So that's going to be something we go over in the next video. If you want to make sure that you know when that video is put up on YouTube, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. Like if you enjoyed the video, and I appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.